So hello and welcome everyone to our second day. If you haven't been here yesterday, I'm Stefano Barazza. I'm an associate professor in IP and legal technology at Swansea University and the academic lead of the Legal Innovation Lab Ways. I will be chairing this morning, and then I will pass the baton to Kate and Nirvine for the afternoon. So we had a full day yesterday looking at some new experiences and research into accessibility legislation. We heard about some very interesting academic research into prediction using legislation and case law to understand how the law is applied in concrete situations. We also had a very interesting sort of theoretical contextualization of accessibility in the words of Professor Frederick Schauer. And we ended the day yesterday with another very insightful presentation from Megan Ma, a researcher at Stanford, who kind of gave us an insight into the language in which law is written and the way in which this language is changing. We have a number of very exciting and interesting speakers lined up for today as well. We start this morning with Kate Hanna. Kate is a legislation service consultant at the Jersey Drafting Office, and she's going to tell us more about how legislators can innovate. So her talk is entitled Innovating Drafting Solutions, and she's going to in particular use the example of an app that focuses on improving drafting instructions on governmental fee amendment legislation. And she's going to use this to also introduce us to the process of innovation with government bodies, which will give us, I'm sure, a lot of ideas also for the remaining parts of this week where we switch to hackathon format. So Kate, over to you. Just a reminder to everyone that this session is recorded. So if you do not want to appear in the recording, please keep the camera switched off. And otherwise, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Stefano. I'm just going to share my screen. So this presentation, as Stefano said, is about the nature of innovation in one particular drafting office through the lens of a case study, and in this case, the development of an app to help solve a problem. This whole process, its options and context could apply to lots of scenarios, I think. So in this presentation, I will look at the setting that made a particular innovation, that is our app, possible, what it was we did, and what happens next. Firstly, if you're not already familiar with it, welcome to Jersey. Jersey is it's a very small jurisdiction. It's called a Crown dependency, but it's largely self-governing for internal affairs, including making its own legislation. In parliamentary terms, it's unicameral, that is, it has one House of Parliament called the States Assembly. It functions through ministerial but not party government. One of the agencies supporting the government is the Legislative Drafting Office, often called the Office of Parliamentary Counsel in other jurisdictions. And as in other jurisdictions, the function of this office is to write the legislation made by the Assembly and ministers, as well as occasionally by other bodies. So my name is Kate Hanna. Stefano said I work as a consultant on the editorial and technical side of things for the Jersey Legislative Drafting Office. This presentation and the app it describes is a collaboration with Zoe Rilston, who is a drafter in the Jersey office. That is, her day-to-day job is to write legislation based on the policy objectives put forward by instructing officers on behalf of the government. Neither of us are IT professionals or coding developers, although I have in recent years learnt some VBA on the job, which helped me in what we did, but was not essential to it. So we came to it without really knowing how to go about making an app. So to put some context on what we were looking at, there are limitations on options for technical innovation in Jersey. There is interest, but few actual options. The executive and service areas of the government of Jersey have whole of government centrally managed and very stretched IT support services. That is, there is a central service for everyone. In addition, for security, maintenance, and support reasons, government-issued devices are locked down, so the options to just try out technical tools and experiment are very limited. Like many places, we don't have much money or extra time washing about, and that is the case even without the extra pressures of things like COVID, Brexit, and so on. So in this environment, consider that one of the standing issues with technical innovation, certainly from our point of view, is often how do you start? That is, lots of things require server access and installation, a lot of systems knowledge, a lot of setup of configuration, and so on. And even if you get that technical setup sorted, which we can't in Jersey, how do you actually do something that lets you see a useful or usable outcome? How do you move from the theoretical to the real? So the Jersey Drafting Office, though, has a head, Lucy Marsh-Smith, with an ongoing interest in exploring ways to do things better. And this has two effects. One is that there is someone able to make things happen who will listen to ideas and is willing to consider things even if the outcome is uncertain. The other is that you're working in an environment where change and seeking better ways of doing things is relatively normal. So there is a kind of momentum for it. Constant change can be disruptive and requires a lot of work, but it also creates opportunities. The opportunity that we found that helped us move past the problems was to do a course. Courses are often a great way to try out software and other tools that are otherwise out of reach. And a course with a practical aim means you produce something usable. The Drafting Office, particularly Lucy and her deputy Matthew Waddington, watch for and promote courses and training very actively, including courses for what it may at first seem to be tangential things that may not immediately seem to be related to core day-to-day functions. So, what course did we find? It is called Coding the Law, and it is run through Flinders University in Australia. It is available both as a standalone external course, which is what we did, and as part of a law degree. The course involves identifying a legal-based problem and developing an app to help address it. Problems can either be from non-government agencies that work with Flinders and that are assigned to you, or they can be problems you come up with yourself, as long as there's some kind of legal question that needs looking into. Usefully as a window into innovation and what it takes to innovate, the course is not just a matter of learning code. There has to be a plan or some thought given to what you might want to do, or at least the effect you want, even if you don't know how to get there. And critically, the final assessment output for the course is a prototype app. So a very practical approach. So for those of us venturing into the water, not used to this kind of thing, it creates great structure to work through systematically what we want to do. We had to work out the logic of how something worked at each stage, basically chart the steps, identify assumptions and where the limits to project scope were, plan timing and communication, and document the expectations and outcomes. Because the course is directed at solving a problem for a client, we were also required to talk to the client. In our case, we came up with our own problem, so we talked among ourselves. But we also talked to Lucy, the head of office and project sponsor, and we learned to do some code and created an app. It's worth saying at this point that we had the course and then we found a problem. The course is project-based, you develop and solve a problem. And we just found we had a problem ready-made to try in the course. But you could do things the other way around, have a problem and then see what solutions can be found. But anyway, this is what our problem looked like. We decided for the course to base our project on creating an app to help instructing officers prepare information to amend orders that set fees. There had been a long-standing problem with the fees that had occurred again the year before we did the course, so maybe we were primed to look for interesting solutions. In Jersey legislation, government administrative fees are commonly set by orders, and for each amount, in order to change it, the instructing officer has to state what change they want, keep an eye on the percentage change, and state what legislative power is being used to make changes. Fees are usually changed, that is, increased usually, annually, and these routine orders are usually made by the minister, that is, not by the State's Assembly. A fees order may also amend many instruments under many parent laws. Here's an example of fees just set out in the general text of legislation, so you can see what we're looking at. Okay. The instructing officer may want to change just the number or sometimes a sequence of related amounts. Each amount like this is a separate amendment and needs to be assessed for amount of increase in purpose. This is essential for complying with the making powers and is often poorly understood by instructors and can vary in what is permitted from one enabling instrument to another. Here is another example, this time of similar fees in a table. As with the previous screen, the instructions need to specify where this piece of text is that needs to be amended, what to change it to, and why it is being amended. Information then needs to be compiled so we can put together amendments that look a bit like this. So what is being removed? What is being inserted? This is the enacting formula for one fees order. It cites 19 parent instruments. In this case, environment-based laws. So that is, there will be at least 19 separate items of legislation being amended to update lots of numbers all in the one order. And because they are grouped together in one instrument, all the instructions for these generally come in a big job lot, often a very complex spreadsheet. So these are complex for the department to prepare and for the drafting office to disentangle and check as well. If you add short timeframes with everything happening at the last minute at the end of the year, and the situation can become a bit, well, difficult. It was these environment-based fees that really spurred the choice of this problem for our app project, and indeed the use of the app later. So, to sum up, what were the particular issues we were concerned with? Well, we needed to capture changes to lots of instruments and their parent laws, what power the changes were being made under, the detail of the amounts being replaced and what they were to be replaced with. We also needed to know the reason for the change, because some amendment powers are limited in scope, and where possible, the percentage change, again, because some amendment powers are limited in scope. But from our experience, instructing officers may not have had a good understanding of enabling powers for changing fees or how amendments work. So they're not always legally trained or may not have the experience they need to do this. Key information was often left out of instructions. Also, instructions could be confusing or key basic legal requirements and restrictions may not be considered, understood or included. So the drafter coming to these might have to chase for dates and missing information or documents, or wade through complex spreadsheets trying to work out what had been requested and its extent, all when timing was very tight. So we took all these parts of our experience and we put them into the app. So here's how we joined everything up. As the course required, we wrote a project plan where we documented assumptions, timelines, restrictions, and other elements. We also put together the expected way the app would work, basically a flowchart. It looks like this. So this is the app flow as originally proposed. It's close to what we use, but not exactly the same. You don't need to be able to read all the detail in it. The main thing to note is multiple linear steps and a couple of loops inside that. Here's one, here's the second one. To collect sequences of information, for example, multiple provisions that need amending and multiple instruments. Okay. So that's what the loops reflect. We also did what you should always do. We discussed our plan with the client to make sure it would work and was acceptable to them. Now, we were our own client with this project, so we gave ourselves some interesting talks, but we also talked to our project sponsor, and that is Lucy. New tech toys, features and skills, they can be very captivating, but it's important not to get stuck in your own ideas about what things should do or seduced by the options, but to step back and see what is meaningful. And also, in our case, what the actual users of the app, who would actually be the instructing officers, were likely to be good at using. And that was a very valuable process. So now I'll take you through a quick look at the app itself and where we built in what we had identified were parts of our problem. And just to reiterate, we built this app ourselves. We're very proud, by the way, with advice in case of tricky questions from the course tutor, but we wrote it and changed it and found new questions to answer as we went along. Even just being able to start felt like a spur to creative thinking, because you can start to see options and you change the way you actually see things. So the course uses Docassemble, and the app is prepared in this. The code here is a glimpse from our app. Docassemble was chosen by Flinders University, not by us, partly because it is open source, but mostly because it is a platform that lets you create an entire app without having to go and get something else. All the different bits are built into it one way or another, and lots of different ways of doing things. So it uses Python, Markdown, YAML, Ginger, HTML, CSS, all the components we needed. So here's a quick run through, not a live demo at this point, but just to look at key parts of the app and how the problems were built into it. The app is browser-based. It starts with a welcome screen, you can see here, outlining its purpose and use. This detail in the screen, I know it looks like a lot, but if they take the time to read it, also sets expectations on the instructing officer and what they need to look at and provide to the drafting office in the form of instructions if they want to amend legislation. So if they don't know these things, there's not much point in them continuing with the app at this point. Then we have a series of forms. Docassemble uses an interview structure, so you create a series of forms to gather information. When creating an order to amend fees, we need some key information to start with: who the instructing officer is, who will sign the order, and when. Some fields have drop-down lists. This significantly increases the chances of the right description being included and that everyone actually has the current and correct information. It also, of course, saves time. Note the option to select Other at the end. If this is selected, another field appears where the user can put in what they need. So if something happens quickly or there is anything else that we didn't know about, the app doesn't break and the person using it isn't left fudging information just to progress through the app. I've used apps that basically fail because they are hard to update and don't let you use other options if they're out of date, which leaves you trapped and undermines part of the benefit of using the technology. This is one of 4 drop-downs in the app. The lists for creating these are kept in standalone data files. This is for 2 reasons. It's to manage our core code better, but also to make it possible for non-coders in the drafting office to update them. It's the nature of this information that it changes frequently, and you need to make it as easy as possible to maintain it without returning to the original or indeed any developer. So this is a bit of future-proofing, another useful thing to consider for this kind of project. Here is a finished first form. All the information about the instructions in general. You can see here some key fields of information that we knew had previously caused problems and which the instructing officer really needed to think about and make sure were going to work, especially given that these tended to all happen in a rush at the end of the year. These are the last 2 fields, namely when the amendments need to commence, that is, come into effect, and just as importantly, when the amending order needs to be signed. The minister has to be available to sign and not on holidays. In addition, it is important that amendments are made in advance of commencement so that they can be consolidated and publicised. Note that the commencement date information and indeed the signing information in this form is not validated and does not use a date picker, because these are not always actual dates, but they can be descriptions as well. For example, 7 days after the order is signed or when something else commences. This is the kind of thing you need to challenge and plan each step of the way when trying to solve a problem like this. In this next form, we're looking at the instrument to be amended, sometimes called the target. This is the first of the loops from the flowchart. the user can keep selecting more targets. There are drop-down lists here too, to make sure the instruments selected are right. As with the previous screen, there is an option for Other at the end of the list for the instructing officer to add in one that is new if needed. This form also requires the instructing officer to identify what power they are using to make the amendments. That's the last field there. And this has two components: the parent legislation and the provision of that legislation. And this was identified as one of the things that was often poorly understood and required a lot of chasing by the drafter. And without the proper training, instructing officers may not even realize the constraints on these powers. So one effect of the app was to help educate instructing officers by making them consider these requirements. The green text and the little balloon with the question mark you can see on the second field, by the way, are exactly what they look like. Options to click and get help on filling out the field. Now we have what are really the guts of the process, identifying the provision that needs to be amended and how it is going to be amended. These are the individual amounts we saw before in the text and the table. Included here as a requirement to say why the fee is being changed. Again, this is one of the areas identified as problems because the power to amend was poorly understood, and because the drafter needs to assess what is going on. So the user here is challenged to explain themselves. This is the drop-down as well, with a standard answer and an option to put in a different answer. So here the instructing officer goes through all the changes they want to make, itemizing them. You can see at the end there, you can then add another provision or finish. So here is a completed one. This is the second loop from the flowchart. The user can now go through many provisions until they have finished for that target. Then they can then choose to do another target, that is to amend another instrument, or to finish. After that, all of these entries are summarized in an end screen. This particular section shows the information about the instructing officer that were put in earlier, and the necessary dates, and so on. That is followed by all the amendment details that they put in, where the user can review and, as you can see here, edit any items. At the end of this summary is a download option, which then produces a Word document with the same information in it, and also a calculation of just what size fee increase has been included. The Word document can then be reviewed and updated by the instructing officer if necessary, and they send this on to the drafting office. So the idea is we receive a nicely laid out set of information with everything we need to draft in it. It's worth noting that even though we probably could, we have not set out the instructions in the form of an actual amendment draft, that is what the legislation would actually look like, or in the amending form that I showed you earlier. We specifically did not want to show that as something instructing officers should be doing. It's not unusual for instructing officers to try and send us actual amendments rather than describing the policy objective. And this makes effective evaluation and drafting of proposed changes very hard. So instead, a nice to read table. As you can see here, it includes those key things such as the reason for the increase and the amount of the increase, and which is being calculated by the app itself, so the instructing officer doesn't need to do it, based on the amounts included by the instructing officer. It's built into a Word template, so it's easy to update the format and codes in the app, but also easy for the user to edit later. Just for interest, this is the code sitting in the template for feeding the information in the app into the Word template. The two key loops are here too, a loop for each instrument to be amended and another one for each provision. So it actually just builds the tables according to how many they they need to be and how long they need to be. So what did all this translate to? Well, Zoe, the other person in the project, ran information sessions for instructing officers to step through how to use the app. Then fees amendment orders for 2021 were made using these instructions. And this is one way innovation can be supported. Lucy saw the potential of the app and was in a position to mandate its use, so we could immediately try out what benefit it could bring. This is part of the flexibility of a small office where we tend to know most of the people we are working with, and within our own sphere, we're quite agile. 100% compliance was intended for instruments prepared at the end of the year, and we came close to that. But the way matters come into the Jersey office can vary, and that accounted for a couple that we missed. And you can see here some numbers about the amendments done. So even though some of these numbers are small, in the context of Jersey, the impact is still large, because even small improvements make a profound difference. And more qualitatively, the reduction in stress caused by fees amendments was also quite noticeable. It was felt very keenly by those of us working in the area. And generally and importantly, with the app and the formal structure and requirements around deploying it, more instructions were received on time. There was more engagement with the process and more confidence that the instructors looked at everything they needed to. So at the end of that first round of the process last year, I can say that there are several more things that make a difference to innovation in the context of an agency like the Drafting Office. Firstly, awards. This is a picture of the award for our app work in the Government of Jersey Annual Awards last year. It's the Innovation Award. Now, we love the project anyway. It is incredibly beguiling to be working so creatively on solutions to issues. But even that this award exists and is given the way it is makes a difference. I said earlier that the controlled technical environment in Jersey made it difficult to just experiment wildly with things that need technology. But that doesn't mean that the value of innovation is not understood. It's a real and necessary thing for services for Jersey. Also, patience and friendliness from colleagues also counts, and also from the actual users of the app, that is the instructing officers. Sometimes innovation can just be a nuisance and another thing to deal with on top of other work and other stresses. It's very important to appreciate this, but everyone put up with it very well and took an interest. We're very grateful. Talking at conferences like this is also supportive. That others may be interested or that you could support or give flight to their interests is also exciting. So, what next then? For this project, there are a few strands. First, confirming that we want to use the app again. This is an evaluation of usefulness to the office, keeping in mind how the instructing officers found it and used it. The plan at this stage is to use it, but even if we didn't, that wouldn't mean it wasn't a good idea or worth trying. Part of being able to innovate is the space to modify or change tack. Second, for using the app, we will make updates and improvements based on how we saw users interacting with it, and also what we would just like to see it do. Thirdly, we need to see if we can sort out the hosting of the app. One of the side effects of producing it as part of a course, it is still hosted on Flinders University servers, which is not ideal for legally privileged documents. Fourthly, the Flinders course coordinator has asked the Jersey office to be a client, that is, to propose some problems for the students in the course to solve. And this way, we become one of the supporters of innovation as well by providing a framework for it. And of course, we might have some of our other challenges solved for us. And then, maybe in association with that student work or of our own accord, we might look at the idea of common legislative solutions. This is a way of trying to guide and standardize things that are common in legislation, such as setting up statutory bodies or creating criminal offences, and other things that ideally should be approached in similar ways using standard text, and that may, like fees, require standard elements to be considered. Drafting officers like ABC UK, Scotland and Wales have done great work in this area, and Jersey would love to take some of those and adapt them for our use. So thanks to everyone who's worked on that. The idea is that a version of the app could be used to support and direct questions about drafting for some of those common legislative questions or similar drafting programs. Zoe and I are also working with our colleague, Matthew Waddington, on Rules as Code and other projects relating to technology and the law. These ideas are mostly behind the scenes. That is, they're about how we prepare things and improving that process. We hope this results in better legislation or makes the process more efficient. But also, the ideas behind the process can be applied to many other problems, including public-facing ones. And if you would like to try the app, by the way, then feel free to get in contact with me. And that was our innovation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was really interesting. Yeah, I was aware a little bit of what was happening in Jersey, mainly through conversation with Welsh Government. It was very nice to see in action, you know, the actual app that you have created, although only for a presentation. We can open the floor to questions, but I have a first question that is triggered by, in particular, your last slide. And so you mentioned the rules as code sort of program of work that we heard a little bit about yesterday as well. And I was wondering, how do you see the future of these apps in a world where rules may be drafted as code in the future? Because it sounded to me like when you are able to collect the information that you need, then anyway, you have to go for a fairly traditional process to amend the law and then implement these amendments and so on. But the rules as code would allow some sort of almost automatic change to happen. So I was wondering if you can share some thoughts on this.
That's an interesting thought. Almost automatic changes to happen. I think those are words to set fear into the hearts of all legislative drafters. We hadn't really considered the two as being connected, merely because for drafting purposes, like for the Jersey office, our focus for rules as code is largely is logic driven and about how to query and use the logic built into the language of legislation, rather than about what that actually says. So I know other parts of rules of code are actually often looking at calculating or evaluating entitlements and things like that, which is perhaps more where this would fit in. So for the Jersey context, there's no immediate connection between them at the moment. And because there's always this question of instructions to change things have to come from the government. It's not an assessment of something. Whether they could build in sort of more kind of natural queries to build things that then are requests to actually make legislation. Yeah, that can probably happen. Wouldn't surprise me if they're attempting something along those lines, but that always has to come as an external request. We don't decide we want to change things. There always has to be a policy objective that you're trying to meet, not just an amount you're trying to change, or an actual policy objective like cost recovery or something like that. And then that has to be approved and each item considered individually. So it's not, we don't sort of see a direct connection at the moment, but it's interesting that that's what you thought of when you saw it. So I'm thinking, well, maybe we should be thinking more creatively about this.
I guess, you know, my reflection comes from a life before academia, if you like, where, of course, coming from Italy, I remember dealing with lots of amendment of laws, which are never sort of consolidated back into the original act that has been amended. So in order to find, for example, the new level of fines in that have been amended maybe 5 or 6 or 7 times, you have to look at a number of different acts that have done that over time. And the reflection looking at your app was that when you collect all the information you need for that amendment, that if we looked at a piece of legislation as something that is akin, for example, to computer code, then we could identify certain elements such as the level of a fee as a variable. And that would be very easy to update and change as amendments are made. So you would actually potentially have the benefit of consolidating all the amendments into the original piece of legislation. So You will also be able to track the amendment over time, of course, because you also need that. But you would at any time kind of have an automatically updating piece of legislation, if that makes sense. It's actually a reflection that also comes from what we heard yesterday from Stanford. We had a very interesting presentation about the language of law, if you like, and the way that this language is changing. And this was one of the things that came out of that. So treating certain elements of legislation almost as objects or concepts.
It's data, and it's an interesting thought, because it's something that we're always looking at, is how can we build, once we've drafted something, how can we actually build that so that it creates automatic consolidation? We consolidate all changes now, but we do it all manually. And this process of actually just being able to mark up something and say, okay, given this policy objective, these are the changes we want to make. And then that creates a proposed piece of legislation that can be voted on or signed, but also it's sitting there waiting for you. So your consolidation's ready to go. And you can just say, okay, go. And it's available. It's something we always want. And yes, we've now captured this information as nice little table fields, very processable, and you can actually export. We're using a Word file, but you can export it as Excel too if you prefer to process that, or CSV or whatever. And so yes, you're right, it's all just sitting there saying, I'm a piece of data, what do you want to do with me? And we're actually then not using it like that. So it's, I guess, sort of legislation is very traditional. It takes a lot to actually change it, but until you've actually got those things working together, it's hard to go from nothing and all manual to a fully complete system. So the question is there a way of getting there in increments, perhaps, that makes it more possible? But yes, you're right. We've actually put them in identifiable bits. So what can we do with that? Part of the problem is that instructing officers, it turns out, aren't actually very good at correctly identifying the bits. So the actual input data is not 100% reliable. And that's one of the things we're thinking about. How can we encourage them to be more reliable in their understanding of and inclusion of the information? It's one of the things we got from looking at what instructions they actually produced using the app. And we thought some of them still just don't fundamentally understand some things, but other things, we could make them clearer. Let's make it easier. What else can we do? So yes, there is always that question that this initial information was not actually produced by the drafting officer. We haven't vetted it, and that happens as part of the drafting process.
Yeah, I know.
Yes, I'm thinking about. I'm thinking, what else can we do? So, which is part of the fun of actually talking at things like this. Is you say, what else are you doing? So.
Yeah, well, I guess that a lot of this brought to memory some of the discussions we had with Wash Government around the use of XML markup languages like a Comantoso, for example, to kind of identify and annotate legislation. And if you were able to kind of marry the two things to some extent, then you could really do something with that information.
That would be.
I like the point you've made about instructing officers. That was a reflection I also made looking at your presentation, thinking, once you, of course, with the knowledge that you have as a drafter, once you create an app of this sort and you identify the information you need and so on, you're going to almost educate the instructing officers as well. So I guess there's a benefit in terms of efficiency of the process overall as well.
Oh, yeah, very much so. But what we also found going through this process was that we could probably, and it's something we've been worried about for a while, but the importance of looking again at the way we structure our legislation is important. We could actually improve that structure to make it easier to reference and describe and easier to do amendments. The nature of legislation is that it's fluid, but the way we set things out doesn't always facilitate actually referencing things properly. So one of the things it's done is it's fed back into discussions about our drafting style. Can we make it easier? Can we make it better? And that would actually help, we think, things like any move to XML or rules as code kind of work as well. As the more you can create a clear, regular structure, it actually helps across the board. So we've found that yes, there's this big feedback loop from actually having developed the app and actually deployed it and seeing what happens next. And you think, oh, is that what happens? How do we make that better? Okay, so some things we thought could happen, and then other things were just completely left field. So it's But it creates this feedback loop and it actually improves it each time. So it's really valuable, the fact that we actually got to deploy it. We actually used it live. We didn't just run some test data through it, because that's never quite the same as getting people new to it to actually have a go in live conditions. So yeah, it's an interesting loop to be in, and what can we do with it and how far can we take it? We're not working in an XML environment, so we don't get to quite play with that yet. It's an exciting thought, though.
Yeah, but the future is clearly there. Let me ask if there are more questions around the room, because I find this discussion really fascinating, but I'm sure that others will have comments or questions. Caitlin.
Morning. I suppose my question is kind of a little bit about legal tech, because often when we come to these discussions, individuals have expertise in one area, legal or tech. So how easy was it for you and members of your department to sort of learn the basics of coding as you sort of pursued this app?
Well, basically just the two of us working on it. So it was Zoe, who's a lawyer, a drafter, although quite happy zooming about in tech. I work on this sort of support side, normally called editorial. I'm not legally trained, and neither of us had any specific background or training in technical things. As I mentioned, the last few years, I've kind of learned some VBA as we went along, which is kind of accessing that kind of coding sector of your brain. But we don't think it was essential for what we did, and the course is designed for people who actually don't know. Lawyers and drafters in particular are often very logically minded, because that's what you do when you draft, is you have to break things down into its logical sequences and components. So that whether that helps, I'm not sure. At first, it was a bit of a shock jumping into the environment, and because it didn't just use one thing, because it wasn't just Python and it wasn't just Markdown or anything. You're actually using these things interchangeably in the one bit of code, and had to get your head around when you were using what and what it did and all of these kinds of things. But once you get going and pick up what the fundamental logic of the things is, then it's, you can experiment with things. And it was a course, so it was guided. So with the material, they would introduce particular concepts about using the loops or external files and things like that. And you actually just built it up like you do in any course where you're learning something new. And you go from, asking the age-old question, why does indexing start at 0, to actually having an app in a relatively short time. So I think it really helps the fact that it's a project you actually work with someone on too, so you don't feel isolated and things like that. I think some of the project teams are a little bit bigger, 3 or 4 people. But Zoe and I kind of work together day to day, work for the same office. So we found that kind of very good. So if you were kind of getting a bit stuck or frustrated or something, you always had someone to bounce it off with. Now, of course, Flinders University is in Australia, in South Australia. So there's a big time zone difference. So we couldn't always just lob into the course coordinator during working hours and say, hi, my loop's stuck. So we tried to sort of work together on things and disentangle them as best we could, and then deal with that if we needed to. But it was actually, it wasn't dead easy, but we did actually get there. Actually, kind of very exciting. And as we move together, we're always looking around, we see something and say, oh, can we add that to our app? So it certainly hasn't put us off. And it was one of the things that the course aimed to do, is to get people who are not developers at trying something. I understand the undergraduate version, as part of the law degree, has a combination of legal students and programming students in it. So I don't know if they then find that you actually get less take up by the non-developers doing the technical stuff. But for us doing the external version, that was part of the point, is what can you do for yourself?
Okay, thank you. That was a great answer. Cheers.
Brilliant. Any more questions for Kate?
Would you like to see some data files, or should I start showing the app? I'll probably show you some files if you want to see some.
Yeah, that would be great.
Just while people are thinking about their questions. Actually, I'll just share my screen again.
So we are looking at the code for the list that we saw as a drop-down list in the beginning of your file. We cannot hear you, or at least I cannot hear you. Yes, you are muted.
Sorry, it actually switched that off when I showed my screen. That's very exciting.
Yes, it has muted you automatically.
Yes, it mutes me automatically. That's very exciting. Yeah, basically, we've got some data files that we use for other purposes on our Government of Jersey setup. And we don't really want to keep two sets of data files. We'd rather just have one. But because of the current hosting, we can't try and pick up those data files automatically. It's one of the things we'd like to do. We're working on getting the hosting moved, but it's quite difficult when you've actually got such a controlled environment. As soon as the Government of Jersey hosts DocAssemble, they become responsible for maintaining it. And it's a difficult thing for departments to commit to if it's not kind of mission critical. So it's one of the downsides. Is we control our own code because we wrote it, but we don't control where it is at the moment. So that's just an interesting factor in what's happening.
Yeah, well, it's one of those practicalities, right? That at the end, especially for government and in law, matter a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think sorry, I see there's a message in the chat. Let me see. So Claire Fife was asking the lessons of government parts, whether you had to go through approvals within government to develop new tech.
It could be a problem in this case, because we did a course, we didn't need to get approval from anybody. And it's interesting, we deployed it without getting approval from anybody. We basically made the decision as an office ourselves. There were no particular restrictions on it. The material we deal with is not confidential in that sort of state security kind of way. It's just legally privileged, like any material from a client. And it's not particularly sensational because it's just talking about fees. And that there's no personal data involved or anything like that. So we don't need to go through any kind of data protection questions. The main issue was the actual emails and things for the instructing officers, which they give to us anyway. So it's one of those things that you would have to consider about what kind of approvals you need to do things. We need to get their agreement if to persuade them to host it. But that's not a policy or approval or anything. It's just a do they have the resources to do it question. I think it helps us that we won an award because that actually gives it a kind of standing and explanation that it might not otherwise have had. It all helps if you're trying to sort of persuade people to actually take up something that may not have that much meaning to them. It's not a process they normally see, and it's not public facing, so they don't see a benefit to the taxpayer, as it were. But no, at this point, no, we haven't really had to get any approvals. We just kind of did it. It depends on the context, but it's part of the advantage of doing a course.
Yeah, Claire says, full of admiration for this solution. It's very interesting what you just said, because I ran through the year a series of talks for my students with legal innovators, basically within law firms and startups. And what we hear from legal operations teams within law firms is essentially and perfectly on the lines of what you just said, right? Starting with small things that don't require too much, approval from the higher ups, sort of win awards, do things that kind of improve perhaps the efficiency of a process, for example, as almost a Trojan horse to then do more widespread innovation. So it's interesting that to some extent, at least in Jersey, it works within government pretty much as it does within law firms.
Well, there's actually a lot in common, and you've all got ongoing questions that just repeat over and over again as well, where you need to be able to prepare some kind of response to it. And yes, it's actually private law firms that are the main focus for the course at Flinders, for the externally run one, not a government agency like us. And it was quite a novel experience for them to work with, firstly, people on the other side of the world, and secondly, a drafting office, that is where the law actually originates. So it's a different thing, but basically those elements that sit behind these legal offices are kind of similar, and you're starting with these questions and this information about how to compile a coherent response to that, and that's kind of what we're doing, and that's what they're doing. So I think there are lots of things in common. we just don't think in 6-minute increments though. So
yeah. Let me say a very big thank you, Kate. You've been fantastic, and congratulations on everything you've achieved, and especially the attitude that I think you brought to this room as well, full of curiosity and kind of passion for this legal tech innovation that you've been able to introduce in Jersey. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, welcome. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much.